So this is episode 7, part 8 on YouTube, and part 30, I think, on TikTok. Sorry if you hear any background noise. There's a lot of people moving around, but I hope that you'll enjoy this episode. I'm going to combine two siblings, Anacaona and Behechio, also known as Anacaona, the male version of Anacaona. And as a reminder, I'm doing all of these videos for us, those who were born and raised, or whatever your situation is, outside of the island, so that we can better understand our history, our culture, and who we are as a people. And I could definitely say that these videos are not just for us Dominicans. This is the beginning of all of Latin America. So no matter what country you are from, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela, Colombia, etc., etc., you're more than welcome to take the time and learn about the beginnings of the Spanish colonial conquest. Because each conquest was different. Every single country that now exists in Latin America got a different version of the Spanish. That's why even though we all speak the same language, technically, it is so different. And also our customs are so different as well. But this is a continuation of my series on the forgotten Taino and Taina warriors of 1492 to 1540, Anacaona and Behechio. The land of the Siboneyes was described in the following way. Bartolomé de las Casas says that Jaragua, this kingdom right here, was the most advanced of all of the kingdoms on the island. I have read in some places that it was the Siboneyes on this side of the island that called the island Haiti. While the rest of the island, for example, on this side, in Higüey, called it Quisqueya, and in the middle portion, called it Behechio. But Bartolomé de las Casas says that Jaragua was the most advanced of the kingdoms, both in language and culture. It was described as having the main court of the entire island. Anacaona and Behechio were siblings. In some places, I have read that they were from the same mother, and others that they were from different mothers. However, it can be a clue that they had the same name, Anacaona and Anacachoa, the male version of Anacaona. This could be a clue that they were possibly twins. And we know through the Taino's legends that they were blessed with twins and maybe even quadruplets. There is a myth, a Taino myth, that describes quadruplets. Their father was el Cacique con Catequa. We don't know enough about the Taino political system to understand why Concatequa named both of his children as his heirs. But I'm not sure if that's actually the case, because when we hear about Behechio and we get to know about Anacaona, it is never mentioned that she's the Cacique. She's the Cacique after Behechio died. Among the two of them, the first Cacique that we hear is about Behechio. And we don't know when he was born. What we do know is that when a Cacique had a child, something special happened. Bartolomé describes the process. He says, cuando a algún cacique le nace un hijo, acuden los reyesuelos vecinos, cada cual saluda al niño de manera distinta. Salve, lámpara brillante, dice uno. Reluciente, exclama otro. Y los demás lo llaman domador de enemigos, nieto de un héroe esforzado, más brillante que el oro, y otras variaciones o variedades. Así recién nacido ha de llevar el nombre, los régulos le imponen. This was one of the ways that the caciques ended up with more than 50 names, which was the case of Behechio. We know he was given around 40 names. Some of them were Huiu, which meant Alteza or Your Highness. Estaré, reluciente, or something very bright. Turiega Obin, resplandeciente como el latón, shiny like brass. Dueniquen, Rio Rico or Rich River. And as I mentioned already, Anacachoa, or golden flower. First time that Behechio appears in the record is when Guacanagueri, goes back to Colon in 1494 and tells him that the caciques in the area have now become his enemy. He accuses Behechio of unaliving one of his wives and of Caunabo stealing another. So from the very beginning, Behechio's introduction to Colon is negative. So he's already in his mindset that this is an enemy cacique. We know from the beginning that Behechio is not happy with these people on the island. That is why he attacked Guacanagarim. Caunabo was Behechio's brother-in-law, so they had united in their stance, in their belief that these foreigners had to be taken off the island. Both he and Caunabo would attack any Spanish that they found. It is also believed that Behechio was one of the caciques that basically threatened Guarionex and convinced him to throw out Fray Ramón Pané from his Yucayeque. We know that in March 1495, La Batalla del Santo Cerro, the first, I'm going to say, formal battle in the Americas happened. And as Ojeda began to pacify El Cibao, he had managed to capture Caunabo, but it is known that his brother-in-law, Behechio, escaped. So initially, Ojeda had captured Behechio, but he had managed to get out and go back to Jaragua. With the help of Caunabo's brother, Manihuatex, Behechio tried to rescue Caunabo from La Fort Isabela at least 5 times, but Ojeda always managed to defeat them. As all of these things are unfolding, there's one person who isn't mentioned. The beautiful Anacaona is not mentioned in these beginnings of this tale. However, she later on becomes such an important figure that even to this day, we still speak about her, we still admire what she did and how she tried to free her people from a violent encounter with the Spanish. We don't know much about Anacaona's early life. However, what we do know from Taino childhood, we also know that as a cacique's daughter, she lived inside the cane. So in basically their sort of temple where the semi of the Yucayeque was located. So she would have seen her father perform caoba ceremonies, go into a trance, and communicate with the ancestral spirit. She would have also been taught all of the secrets of the caciques and how to get that connection or go into that connection in order to speak with the semis. We know that she would have been trained in everything: archery, weapons, pottery, cooking. She would have learned absolutely everything in order to be able to best lead her people. But what Anacaona was most renowned for was her ability to compose and sing areito. Even Bartolomé de las Casas describes how wonderfully she would perform them. And she was so renowned that even more than 20 years later, they were still speaking about her abilities to perform areito. That would tell us several things about her. That she was very intelligent, 1. 2, that she had a very powerful mind. Because in order to perform areitos, you had to memorize every single letter, every single lyric from that song. Because remember, the Tainos did not have a physical writing system. So every single performance was made from her mind. She didn't have anything to guide her. And it could have been that this great ability is what made her a center of attention. Not everybody could perform areitos in that particular way. She was probably known as a tequina, which is a Taino word meaning teacher. Tequinas were always the leaders of the areitos, and everybody followed their lead. It could have been during the areitos that she caught the eye of Caunabo. But as I explained in his own episode, Caunabo was not a Taino. And in order to marry the daughter of a cacique, he had to be a cacique himself. But because he was a foreigner, he had to go through certain tests to prove that he was worthy of her hand. It's possible that as she performed, she could see him eyeing her. She could feel his interest. And mind you, she had to be pretty young. She had to be a teenager at this time. But we all know what it feels like to have that sort of connection with someone. So because Kaunabo had to fulfill more requirements than the normal person, he had to be brought to La Profetisa Joima. As I explained in Kaunabo's episode, Joima was La Profetisa de la Isla, and to her were brought many people. But she was mainly used as an advisor for the caciques and cacicas. Caunabo was brought to her in order to be approved. She had him pass certain tests, she looked for certain skills. But what we can ask ourselves, better said, if Anacaona, Behechio, and her dad, Concatecoa, had to be present. Because it was because of Anacaona that he was being presented to Joima. But if they managed to go, they would have had to purify themselves. They had to do certain ceremonies, certain diets. But either way, we can imagine her thinking, whether she was there or if Anacaona was back at home in Jaragua, waiting, she would have still had that feeling of did he pass? I'm sure she was nervous, anxious to know if this man would end up being her husband. But Canabo passed, and Joima crowned him el cacique de la Maguana. Bartolomé de las Casas says que Anacaona fue una notable mujer, muy prudente, muy graciosa y palanciana en sus hablas y artes y meneos, y amicísima de los cristianos. Fue también reina de la Maguana, porque fue mujer del rey Caunabo. So we can imagine Anacaona's excitement to know that this was going to be her husband and that he had the qualities of a leader. Since we aren't sure about how marriages and partnership work with the Tainos, it isn't 100% certain if Anacaona ended up having to move to La Maguana or if she was allowed to stay in Jaragua. What we do know is that when Caunabo was captured in 1495, she wasn't there. The account says that Caunabo was tricked into chains by Ojeda, in that not only him, but all of his wives and children that were in his cane in La Maguana were also taken to La Isabel. Where she was during the time of Caunabo's capture is not described. We have no idea where Anacaona was located because there's no mention that she escaped, that she ran away, nothing. We do know, though, that at this time she had a daughter. The daughter was in her teenage years, so it isn't that she had a baby to take care of, which was a lot of times the case of the women who escaped a lot of the massacres. So where was she? I only found one reference from Bartolomé that says that after Caunabo perished at sea in 1496, she went back to Jaragua. So it could have been possible that she was in La Maguana, but she was doing something. Maybe, I don't know, she was at the river, she was busy in some way. She just wasn't there. I've also thought that maybe she watched. She saw them come. We know that Caunabo was an extremely stubborn man. She might have told him, don't go with them. This is weird. And he didn't listen. She might have just backed away, went somewhere else, and just wasn't involved in the capture because she could sense that there was something going on. There was some sort of danger. I also thought that since Caunabo did a ceremony in order to put these chains on, we know that they went to a river. She might have accompanied them and just sat at the river. And then when they went back up to the cane, maybe she just stayed there. But whatever was the case, she would be instrumental later on in influencing her brother, Behechio. So we know that by 1496, she is back in Jaragua at the end of 1496. And she took her daughter with her, her only daughter named Iguanamota. But Iguanamota is going to get her own episode, so we'll talk about her more later. Anacaona returned to Jaragua with her brother, Behechio. While there, they learned that Bartolomé Colón had decided to dominate them. and they prepared, at least Behechio began to prepare for war. So after La Cacica Samayaca, if you guys remember, or Catalina, as she was named by the Spanish, allowed Bartolomé Colón and Miguel Diaz to establish Santo Domingo. Bartolomé decided, you know what, I need to continue dominating the island because he continued to hear about different rebellious attacks from different parts of the island. But the one that he heard about the most was Jaragua. So I've read several different versions of what happens next. But the point is that Bartolomé travels from Santo Domingo to Jaragua. And on the way, people notice that he's going towards Jaragua. So people start running towards Behechio to warn him of the incoming of the Spanish. At least that's what Bartolomé says. So Behechio was already preparing for war, and we can assume again that Anacaona was present, even though she had already told him not to engage in war. And Angleria says that it's because she saw what could happen. She was fearful. She thought that it was better to cooperate. But it seems like Behechio initially did not pay any mind to her. But as the messengers started arriving and telling him that all of these men were coming, it might have done something to his mind. As they got nearer to Behechio's Yucayeque, the Christians started to see more and more people. Bartolomé writes, Los cristianos, viendo el ejército, hizo Bartolomé señales de que no los venían a hacer mal, sino a verlos y holgarse con ellos, y que deseaba ver a su rey Behechio y su tierra. Luego los indios se aseguraron como si ya tuvieran grandes prendas de ellos y fuera imposible faltarles la palabra. Van luego volando mensajeros al rey Behechio, o él, si allí iba, y envía a mandar que salgan toda su corte y gente con su hermana Anacaona, señalada y comedida señora, a recibir a los cristianos, y que les hagan todas las fiestas y alegrías que suelen a sus reyes hacer, con cumplimiento de sus acostumbrados regocijos. Andando otras 30 leguas, llegan a la ciudad y población de Jaragua. Salen infinitas gentes y muchos señores y noblezas que se ayuntaron de toda la provincia con el rey Behechio y la reina, su hermana, Anacaona, cantando sus cantares y haciendo sus bailes que llamaban areitos, cosa mucho alegre y agradable para ver cuando se ayuntaban muchos en número especialmente. Salieron delante 30 mujeres, las que tenía por mujeres el rey Behechio, todas desnudas, en cueros, solo cubiertas sus vergüenzas con unas medias falditas o faldillas de algodón, blancas y muy labradas en la tejedura de ellas, que llamaban naguas, que les cubrían desde la cintura hasta media pierna, traían ramos verdes en las manos, cantaban y bailaban y saltaban con moderación como a mujeres convenía, mostrando grandísimo placer, regocijo, fiesta y alegría. Llegáronse todas ante don Bartolomé Colón, y las rodillas hincadas en tierra con gran reverencia, danle los ramos y palmas que traían en las manos. Toda la gente demás, que era innumerable, hacen todos grandes bailes y alegrías, y con toda esta fiesta y solemnidad, que parece no poder ser encarecida, llevaron a don Bartolomé Colón a la casa real o palacio del rey Behechio, donde ya estaba la cena bien larga, aparejada, según los manjares de la tierra, que era el pan de casabe, utías, los conejos de la isla, asadas y cocidas e infinito pescado de la mar y del río que por allí pasa. Después de cenar, vanse los españoles cada 3 o 4 a las posadas que les habían dado, donde tenían ya sus camas puestas, que eran las hamacas de algodón muy hermosas, y para de lo que eran ricas. El don Bartolomé Colón, con media docena de cristianos, quedóse aposentado en la casa del rey Behechio. Otro día hubieron concertado en la plaza del pueblo, hacerle otras muchas maneras de fiestas y así llevaron al don Bartolomé Colón y cristianos a verlas. Estando ella, salen súbitamente dos escuadrones de gente armada con sus arcos y flechas, desnudos empero, y comienzan a escaramuzar. So they started to do like a demonstration, like a war demonstration, y jugar entre sí. Al principio, como en España, cuando se juega a las cañas, poco a poco comienzan a encenderse y como si pelearan contra sus muy capitales enemigos, de tal manera se hirieron que cayeron en breve espacio 4 de ellos muertos y muchos bien heridos. Todo con todo el regocijo y placer y alegría del mundo, no haciendo más caso de los heridos y muertos que si se les dieran un papirrote en la cara, durara más la burla y cayeron hartos más sin vida, sino que a ruego de don Bartolomé Colón y de los cristianos mandaron cesar el juego al rey Behechio. Esta manera de juegos escaramuzales se usaban antiguamente. So this was their way of welcoming them, of showing them that they were on their side. They didn't want problems with these people. And they did what they could to show them that they didn't want to be enemies. So after stopping the war demonstration where several of the indigenous people were killed and others wounded, Bartolome decided to talk privately with Behechio and Anacaona. He took the time to explain to them, basically, and we can assume that he had indigenous interpreters with him, that the whole purpose of what they were doing was to get tribute. He told them that the main person in charge was actually his brother, Colón, Cristobal Colón, and that he was basically there as his representative. He explained that his brother had been sent by the great kings of Castile, who had many kingdoms and people under their empire, and that Colón had returned to Spain to just let the kings know that he had managed to get several great kings from the island to begin the tribute system, and that Colón then had sent him, Bartolomé, to do the same with them, to start a tribute system with things that they could give in tribute. He had also told him that Guarionex, Guacanagari, several of the other caciques of El Cibao were already giving tribute in gold. But as Bartolomé recounts the tale, this alarmed Behechio. And he said, how can I give you gold when we don't even have that in my territory, one, and two, my people don't even know what gold is. And supposedly Bartolomé tried to calm him and said, no, we don't want you to pay tribute in anything that your land doesn't already have. We want you to pay tribute in things that you know you can pay. And Bartolomé records the response of Bartolomé Colón, and he says, sabemos que abundáis, que es mucho algodón y pan casabe. Queremos que tributéis de lo que más en esta tierra hubiese, pero no de lo que no hay. And supposedly Behechio got excited and happy. He was like, oh, is that what you want? No worries. Ask as much as you want. I will give you everything until you don't want any more. He quickly sent messengers all over his province and told the other caciques under him to start planting. They needed lots of cotton, they needed lots of cassave, they needed lots of everything, because all of those items had to be sent to the king and queen of Castile. Bartolomé de las Casas uses this story to kind of demonstrate how wonderful, or better said, what kind of person Behechio was. Because he states he could have killed them. He could have just killed all of them right there in his Yucayeque. There were more than enough people to take them all down. They were even given iguanas to eat. The iguana, which is a Taino word, was reserved only for the nobles in indigenous society. And Bartolomé Colón and his men were offered iguana, the biggest delicacy for the Tainos. Only about 6 or 7 months later, in 1497. Behechio and Anacaona sent out messengers to Bartolome in La Isabela and told him, you better come get your tribute. Bartolome Colon was very surprised that they had been able to plant the cotton, harvest it, and then get it ready. So he wanted to go see it himself. He said, okay, no worries. I'm going myself to make sure that you have the tribute. So he gets to Jaragua again, and he is received by Anacaona and about 32 other caciques. And Behechio, of course, was present. And this is what Bartolomé de las Casas says was given in tribute. He says, mandado traer muchas cargas de algodón en pelo y la con su presente de muchas utías, que eran los conejos de esta isla, y mucho pescado, todo asado, lo cual todo, cada uno le presentó, so each cacique presented, de que se hinchió de algodón, digo, una grande casa. Dióles a todos los señores muchas gracias, y al rey Behechio y a la señora su hermana, muchas más y más grandes, mostrando señales de grande agradecimiento, como era razón dárselas, ofreciéndose a traerle tanto pan casabi que hinchiese otra casa y casa. So they offered to make even more casabe to fill another house. In other words, this kingdom was very different than the other kingdoms of the island. They were very well organized. They respected each other on a different level than we've seen with the other caciques. Bartolomé Colon ended up having to send for 2 ships from La Isabela to Jaragua by sea in order to be able to transport all of this produce that Jaragua had given him. And it said that the men in La Isabela were so overcome with joy to see these 2 ships full of produce, full of food, full of supplies that they desperately needed because they were starving. This isn't the end of this transaction. Bartolomé de las Casas tells us that Anacaona then said to her brother Behechio, why don't we go see the ships? Let's go see the Spanish ships or the Spanish canoas. And the supposed reason that Anacaona wanted to see the Spanish canoa was because she wanted to give them special pieces of cotton. Bartolomé de las Casas explains, dice, Anacaona, allí tenía esta señora una casa llena de 1000 cosas de algodón, de sillas y muchas vasijas y cosas de servicio de casa, hecha de madera, maravillosamente labradas, y era este lugar y casa como su recámara. Presentó esta señora a don Bartolomé muchas sillas, las más hermosas, que eran todas negras y bruñidas, como si fueran de azabache. Todas las otras cosas para servicio de mesa y naguas de algodón, que eran unas como faldillas que traían las mujeres desde la cintura hasta media pierna, tejidas y con labores del mismo algodón, blanco a maravilla, cuantas quiso llevar y que más le agradaban. Diole 4 ovillos de algodón hilado, so thread, in thread form, que apenas un hombre podía uno levantar de tan pesado. Cierto, si oro tuviera y perlas, bien se creía entonces que lo diera con tanta liberalidad, según todos los indios de esta isla, eran de su innata condición dadivosos y liberales. Vanse a la playa o ribera de la mar, manda a don Bartolomé venir la barca de la carabela a tierra. Tenían el rey, Behechio, y la reina, su hermana, sendas canoas, muy grandes y muy pintadas y aparejadas. Pero la señora, como era tan palanciana, no quiso ir en la canoa, sino con don Bartolomé en la barca. So Anacaona and Behechio decided to go on Bartolomé Colon's ship. But Las Casas says that they became so perturbed or so scared of being on the boat that they jumped off the ship, over the edge of the ship. He writes, turbáronse los reyes y sus muchos criados y privados en tanto grado que les pareció que el cielo se venía abajo y Aina se echaron todos al agua, pero como vieron a don Bartolomé reírse algo, se asosegaron. And then it became the Spanish's turn to have a dance, music, and instruments, which they already carried on board the ship. Anacaona and Behechio made their way back on the ship after jumping overboard because they got scared from the movement of the ship. It was just so amazing to them. And the description is the following of what happened next. It says, era maravilla como se alegraban, miran la popa, mira la proa, suben arriba, descienden abajo, están como atónitos, espantados. Manda don Bartolomé al alzar las anclas, desplegar las velas, dar la vuelta por la mar. Aquí creo yo, this is Las Casas speaking, this is his voice. Aquí creo yo que no les quedó nada de sangre, temiendo no se los llevasen, pero desde que dieron la vuelta hacia casa, quedaron sin temor. Y demasiadamente admirados, que sin remos, la carabela tan grande parecía que volase, y sobre todo que con un viento solo fuerce a una parte y a otra contraria tornar. They then returned to Jaragua on the ship, and hundreds upon hundreds of other indigenous people arrived to finish filling the ships with casabe. And it says that the ships were just filled to the brim with casabe and cotton y otras cosas que el rey y la reina y los otros señores habían dado. And then the ship left. It went back to La Isabela, y don Bartolomé con su gente también acordó irse para allá con su compañía por tierra. Dejó alegres al rey y a la reina y a todos los señores y gentes suyas y muy contentos. What a happy description, right? We hear about music, dancing, instruments on both sides of the culture on the same day. But things didn't stay that way. We know that humans are never satisfied with anything. And in this case, it was an outside force that changed the dynamics between Anacaona and Behechio and Bartolomé Colón. What many don't know about Colón's administration of the island at this time in 1497 was that he wasn't even there. Colón had actually returned to Spain and arrived in Spain in June 11th, 1496. So as Bartolomé was picking up the tribute from Anacaona and Behechio, Colón wasn't even present. He didn't have any idea what was going on the island. But not only was Bartolomé Colón gathering tribute from the indigenous people in Jaragua, or los Tainos de Jaragua, he was also dealing with rebellion in general among the men, the settlers, the Spanish settlers, who were still back in the Isabel. And this rebellious nature of all of these men followed the Colón brothers everywhere. This is an example of when Cristóbal Colón had to fight Francisco Porras in Jamaica, pero en la Española in 1497. Bartolomé Colón was dealing with a character named Francisco Roldán. And Francisco Roldán felt that he had the right to cause chaos and do everything else. So he would demand things from Bartolomé Colón. When he figured out that Bartolomé was not going to betray his brother because he did ask him to join his rebellion, Roldán said, you know what, I need to get out of here. I'm heading to Jaragua. In Jaragua, Roldán was able to convince Anacaona and Behechio to betray Bartolomé Colón and to stop paying tribute. He basically told them, you know what, I'm as big as a leader as they are. I'm a big cacique too. So you know what? You don't have to pay him anymore. I will make sure that this tribute system disappears. So they weaseled their way into the Taino political system, and eventually they became white caciques. Because Roldán wasn't by himself. We know that there were at least another 100 other settlers who participated in this rebellion. Francisco Roldán had been el alcalde mayor de la Isabel, and he had enough charm, charisma, and leadership skills to convince everybody else that eventually went with him that he was the better option. He was better than the Colón brothers. These rebels were eventually known as los Roldanistas. So Francisco Roldan and Anacaona and Behechio became allies, and they allowed them to stay in Jaragua. And not only that, but to gain power. While in Jaragua, they adopted the Cacique tradition of being carried in litters. They did not want to touch the ground. They were that important. They loved Jaragua because they said que ahí las mujeres eran más hermosas y de más agradable trato. Bartolomé de las Casas and Oviedo speak about how Roldan just basically took over. He would steal the other Indians' wives, sisters, mothers. He would use them as waitresses, as laundry women, as cooks. Basically, he wanted to be taken care of, hand and foot. And Bartolomé writes, como si hubieran nacido de ilustres padres, haciendo fuerzas e importunas violencias donde quiera que estaban y andaban, matando y acuchillando fácilmente a cualesquiera tristes indios por cualquiera desabrimiento que ellos tuviesen. Some might ask themselves, why did Anacaona and Behechio allow this? Why did they not get rid of only 100 people? What could explain it is that we know that Caunabo was imprisoned and then sent off to Spain, but he drowned on his way there in 1496. Legend says that Behechio, once he heard that his brother-in-law had perished, he went into a very deep depression. Depression so great that it killed him. Behechio's death resulted in a ceremony. As we know, the Tainos had their traditions in terms of their burial traditions, and Anacaona fully participated in the burial of her brother. Oviedo records what supposedly happened, and it says that one of the traditions for the greater caciques was to be buried and to have one of their wives, at least one, buried alive with him. In the case of Behechio, it is written that supposedly 3 women were buried alive with him, including one of the most beautiful women at the time. And her name was Juana Tabaneque. And it says that she was renowned for her beauty, says Pedro Martí de Angleria. And she was buried alive with 2 other women and the corpse of the cacique by instructions of Anacaona. Each person was given a pitcher of water and some casabe. And supposedly, there were 2 Franciscan monks or friars who witnessed this and heard her screams. There were areitos played, processions, and food. Lots and lots of food. Some say that this description was made just to discredit Anacaona and make her seem cruel and unfeeling, because Juana Tabaneque was forced. She didn't go into the tomb willingly. Oviedo records that it was a tradition that these women would be buried alive, and they had a name. They were supposedly called Atebeyane Nequén. He says that some did it willingly, that it wasn't always forced, but that this particular wife of Behechio was put in against her will. Bartolomé de las Casas says that something even worse actually happened. He says that when Roldan made basically like an agreement with Colón, part of the agreement was the following. He says, tan gran rey como Behechio, que el almirante diese para que sirviese a Roldan, y Roldan lo diese a los hombres viles, y quizá entre ellos azotados para los servir, y que repartiesen entre sí sus vasallos, y mayor tiránica maldad. In other words, it could be possible that when Roldan and Colón fixed things, Behechio, was given as a gift to Roldan. The only problem with this is that we know that Colón was not on the island when this was happening. But it could have been that the timeline is just funky. And when Colón came back in 1498, only a year later, he made this arrangement. But we don't know 100%. What we do know is that by the time Roldan was in full force, Anacaona was by herself. But Francisco Roldan had some sort of magic juice or something, because he had people that supported him through and through. And another person that supported him was Diego Colon, El Indio Diego Colon, the one who had been by Cristobal Colon's side since the very beginning and served him as an interpreter. So Anacaona is caught in the middle of this. She has Roldan just being a menace. Cristobal Colon is back on the island. And all through this, her daughter is then not taken, but put in the middle of a huge, huge mess. But I want to give Iguana Mota her own episode, so I will speak on what exactly happened to her later on. So imagine her frustration. She is a leader, she's a mother, and she's soon going to be a grandmother. So we could just imagine also the fear. She's the leader of all of these people, and they're all looking to her to solve this. Anacaona, we know, was a pacifist. She did not encourage fighting. She did not go out there trying to battle nobody, even though I know that there's some that have portrayed her in that way. She was a pacifist. She did not want conflict. So her approach, unfortunately, was to work with the invaders and try to get a treaty and have good relations with them. But what she didn't know was that Colon had lost his right to be the administrator of the island. Because honestly, I believe that if Colon had stayed as the administrator, we wouldn't have seen the events that later unfolded. In 1499, Francisco Bobadilla came to the island, sent by the Catholic kings to replace Colon. That same year, Colon's younger sons were still in Spain, and they were sent out to the countryside because the rumors about Colon's conduct on the island were so severe that it was feared that the children might be attacked. In 1500, Colon is put into chains by Bobadilla. And not only him, but both of his brothers are also chained and shipped back to Spain. This was November 25th, 1500, when he finally arrived on the Spanish shores. He had to wait until December of that year in order to get an audience with the queen. He's given his audience, he is pardoned, supposedly, but at the end of the day, he is stripped from his mission and given a different mission. You are not to return to the island of La Española. In his stead, Nicolás de Ovando is named governor of the island. And Nicolás de Ovando was sent to replace Bobadilla, because this was just a game to these people. Estaba primero Cristobal Colon, they complained about him, they sent Bobadilla to confirm or discredit the accusations against Colon. Then there were accusations against Bobadilla, so then they sent Nicolás de Ovando to kick out Bobadilla and replace himself as administrator of the island. Nicolás de Ovando arrives in 1501, and from the beginning, he immediately takes over and takes everything. Similar to Francisco Bobadilla when he first arrived. Roldan hears about the arrival of Nicolás de Ovando, and he gets a feeling that this dude is not to be played with. So what does he do? He goes, presents himself, and says, you know what? I need a ticket out of here. I need to get off this island. Nicolás says, oh, no problem. There is literally a boat leaving with Francisco Bobadilla, who I'm kicking off the island. You can go with him. On the boat is also the captured Cacique, Guarionex. They hop onto the boat in June 1502 with about 30 ships carrying what today would be the equivalent, más o menos, of $14 million in gold. But the Taino gods were not happy with this. And on July 2nd, 1502, a hurricane blows through and sinks the ships. More than 500 people drown. Out of those 30 ships, only one survives. The smallest of the ships, named La Aguja. And this one ship was the only one carrying Cristobal Colon's gold. Anacaona's granddaughter, Mencia, is born around 1500, 1501. We can imagine that Anacaona probably helped her daughter give birth to the only granddaughter we know that she had. The funniest thing is that this hurricane was announced by Colon himself. He had left Spain in May 9th, 1502, with his brothers and with his son Fernando, who was old enough to travel. He ends up going to Santo Domingo, the port of Santo Domingo, even though he had been prohibited, but he needed to make port very quickly. He made port in June 29th just to tell them, look, please don't send out any boats. There's a hurricane coming. But Nicolás Ovando didn't care. The rest of 1502, Colon just traveled and explored. And then in July 7th of 1503, he became marooned. He got stuck on Jamaica. And on that boat was his 13-year-old son, Fernando. Colon was so desperate that he even wrote a letter to God asking him to please spare them from the death that was surely coming. He wrote that letter in July, but he had already sent out a rescue party. The rescue mission was headed by Diego Mendez de Segura with some indigenous people aboard. The island of Jamaica to the coast of Aragua wasn't very far, so he literally got there in about 10 days. But he was detained by Ovando and his men for 7 months. He wasn't allowed to even send a message back to Colon, just letting him know that, yeah, he had made it to the island, help was coming. Nothing. Nicolás de Ovando would not allow him to do anything. So what do all of these details have to do with Anacaona? Well, because Ovando decided to basically hold hostage this crewmate of Columbus, he ends up inadvertently giving us an eyewitness to what he did next. Because as Nicolás Ovando was ignoring Colon's warning about the hurricane, ignoring everything else that was being presented to him, he was just concentrating on his desire to pacify the island. And which two regions was giving Ovando the hardest time? Higüey y Aragua. Diego Mendez became a witness to the cruelties of Ovando. He made it to shore in just 10 days. He left with 6 Spanish men and 10 indigenous people. So he had to make his way to Santo Domingo. And Nicolás de Ovando was living in the precursor of what we know as La Fortaleza de Osama. We know that the Fortaleza as we know it now, this remodeling had begun in this year. This structure had held El mismo Colón imprisoned and his brothers before being sent in chains back to Spain by Bobadilla. And imagine that he also subdued a lot of the indigenous people already in the Osama River Valley, which included Sameaca and her people. So Diego Mendez comes in a hurry, trying to get help for Colón, trying to make things happen. But he comes in the middle of this madman's desire to destroy the indigenous people of the land. He actually sent out a kind of like a spying ship to see where Colón was at. And that was it, just to see. Didn't supply anything, didn't try to rescue him. This trip that Diego Mendez had taken from Jamaica to La Española was something so traumatic, so it marked him in such a way that when he died, he asked for the image of a canoe to be inscribed on his tombstone with the word canoa written into the stone. So even though Nicolás de Ovando had plenty of things to distract him, he could not let go of the fact that Anacaona did not fear him and that Higüey could care less. It could be that Nicolás de Ovando heard about Anacaona's pacifist nature and he thought he could take advantage of that and possibly trick her into imprisonment, similar to what Ojeda did to her husband Caunabo years before in 1496. We know that Ovando took about 300 men on foot and 70 men on horse, but she knew he was coming. So she called to her Yucayeque all of the caciques who were under her command. It is assumed that the Yucayeque was Yaguana, because this was the same village that Bartolome visited when he came to visit her and her brother Behechio, but also to collect the tribute that they had gathered. By all accounts, Yaguana was the largest village or yucayeque of all the islands. Pedro Martin de Agleria says that it was about 6 miles from the coast. There were large buildings, including a very large cane, which was the house of the cacique that could hold more than 100 people. It was also a theater, an extremely large bate. They performed many areitos. She told her caciques to get ready for the arrival of the Guaniquina of the Christian. Guaniquina meant the great Lord of the Christians, or El Gran Señor. She told them that they should honor him because her goal was to develop a treaty and bring peace for her people. So I don't want us to think that just because Anacaona was a pacifist, that the indigenous people did nothing about the Spanish. Because even though she didn't directly attack anyone, she did not prevent her people from attacking isolated Spanish settlements. And this is what Nicolás de Ovando was hearing, that the colony was in shambles because basically everybody was running amok. He was given special instructions from the Catholic kings themselves. Las instrucciones al comandador mayor, because that was the name or the title given to Nicolás de Ovando in early 1503, instructed him to do the following. Porque algunos dicen que sería bien que esos indios se repartiesen en pueblos, en que viviesen juntamente y no estuviesen despojados por los montes, y allí tuviese cada uno su casa apartada con su mujer e hijos y su tierra apartada en que sembrasen, y que en cada pueblo hubiese iglesia y capellán que tuviese cargo de los adoctrinar y en instruir in la fe. And the whole point of this was to bring the indigenous people closer to the mines, the gold mines, because that was the whole point, to mine that gold. But Jaragua and Higüey didn't have any gold. So these two places where the indigenous people were running to, were fleeing from Nicolás de Ovando. And both the caciques there, Anacaona and the cacique from Higüey, didn't cooperate with Nicolás de Ovando. They allowed the indigenous people of other tribes to come to them for safety. It is believed that Nicolás de Ovando sent basically like messengers several times to convince Anacaona to ally herself with him. Because yes, there were many indigenous people who went against their own people and allied themselves with the Spanish. But this isn't what Anacaona wanted. She wanted them to work together. And she probably thought that if she could only meet him, maybe things would be different. So when he set out to Jaragua in 1503, around July, Anacaona knew he was coming because this was supposedly a diplomatic visit. We can imagine the preparation. She probably prayed to her God for guidance and visited La Sabia Madre in Yuboa. She probably also consulted her semis, the semis that lived in the Yucayeque. She probably performed the Caoba ceremony with her semi, asking him or her, we don't know what semi they had in her Yucayeque, but asking for guidance, asking it to speak and guide the people and tell them what they needed to do. We can also say that maybe this was what the semi had told her, to just be passive, to wait, to not fight back, to just welcome these strange people into her village and allow whatever happened to happen. She probably sat with her other caciques and cacicas, having discussions, making plans, how they would treat him, what they would do to receive him, the meals they would prepare, the areitos they would sing. They probably thought, you know what, let's just wow him. They probably thought that their customs, their food, their way of life would wow Nicolás de Ovando the same way it wowed Bartolome and Rolando. But this dude was made of something else. We know that the caciques dressed in a very elaborate way. We can assume that Anacaona was no different. However, we don't have anything written about how she was dressed, because these people didn't care. Ovando and his men arrived at the Yucayeque. They received him much in the same way that they received Bartolome Colón, with food, song, and dance. They placed Ovando in the cane, and Anacaona and her people then presented him with hunted animals to eat, with fish from the sea that was still 6 miles away with the finest of cassave. They also fed their horses. And Bartolome says that they also had araitos, parties, happiness, and a ball game, El Bate. It seems that Ovando was there for several days. It says that on a Sunday, Bartolome de las Casas records that on a Sunday, he had his men get on the horses. They then pretended to start a game, basically like a military simulation. Anacaona supposedly said the following, that she wanted to watch. He then told her he had something important to tell her and her people. Could she call them all to the cane? And so she did. So they all packed the cane and sat within it. But Ovando's men were doing something strange. They were circling the cane outside of it on their horses. He had also instructed some men that were on foot to go inside the cane as well. He had told them that when he touched the gold chain that was on his chest, that was the sign to begin tying all of the caciques, including Anacaona. And he gives the sign and they unsheath their sword, and Anacaona and her caciques began to scream, and their screaming alerted the villagers outside of the cane, and all hell broke loose. They began to run. Anacaona's daughter and granddaughter managed to escape, and they ran and ran and ran. They left all of the caciques that had been bound inside of the cane, and only Anacaona was removed. They then proceeded to light the cane on fire. Diego Mendez was eyewitness to La Tarde. He described the panic and the bloodshed. He says that about 82 caciques were unalive that day. Oviedo says it was 80, and La Casa says that it was double that amount. Las Casas says that the fire was so great that only ashes remained of the cacique. Those who didn't manage to flee, many were unalived, as we can imagine, but I'm not going to glorify what the conquistadores did. They've had that already. Know that some were taken as slaves because even Bartolome de las Casas received an indigenous man who had escaped La Tarde Roja de Jaragua. Bartolome says that the excuse that Ovando gave for this massacre was that Anacaona and her caciques were thinking of attacking him in Santo Domingo. But La Casa says that was a lie. They had enough men and horses to easily take over 100 islands. He says, no, the real reason that Ovando hated Anacaona and her caciques was because it was very clear that she did not fear him. And that bothered Nicolás de Ovando because the Spanish had always ruled through fear. But one of the most amazing things that I learned about this event is that many survived. Many managed to escape, including some cacique. One cacique that managed to survive, including his wife, was el cacique, Cacica. His wife was named Acabé, which meant la flor de su corazón. We know that he hid up in the mountain region. El actual paraje, Rancho La Guardia, próximo a Hondo Valle. Legend says that these caciques survived the massacre of 1503. Their names were Yaguaj, Caicedo, Manicuatej, y la Cacica, Leonor de Analiana. Possibly another one named Banin. We know that these caciques were then taken as prisoners and were forced to be part of the construction of La Fortaleza, Osama. In other words, they were the laborers that built La Fortaleza. But one of the most famous people to have survived La Tarde Roja was a young girl named Cuati. She gathered up a group of children, women, and the elder and struggled with them through the jungles for several weeks. They only walked at night in order to escape the Spanish. She was supposed to be the next Sabia Madre, the priestess who basically gave guidance to the caciques of the island. She was being prepared for this role by her grandfather, Cutanai. So she had visited the site of Yuboa several times. But because she fell in love and she had a child, she was disqualified from the priesthood. So she wasn't in the Yucayeque of Anacaona when the massacre happened. She was in un bohío taking care of her baby because she had given birth not too long ago when
the chaos unfold. It's estimated that she was only 16 years old, but she managed to save several people that. But I can just imagine this young girl, just 16 years old, with her first baby and running through the jungle away from the danger, but also going probably through territory that she had never known. We also know of young people that survived. One of them was Caucatej. He was the son of Cacica. Guati managed to save Caucatej, and they all went fleeing to Marian, to the territory that used to be Wakanakari's territory. They stayed there for a long time. We don't know exactly the time frame. However, we do know that Huacatej returned to Jaragua to look for his family. He found nobody. So what did he do? He went to Higüey and kept fighting against Nicolás de Ovando. He did end up perishing, but he is living forever in memory of those who remember him. We also know of a small child that Guati managed to save. His name was Mariani. Another young man that was saved was Tamarej. There's someone else who also survived La Tarde Roja. His name was Guarocaya. Guarocaya. Many believe that this is Enriquillo. However, Oviedo makes a very big distinction between Guarocaya and Enriquillo. And this is exactly what he says. He says, dicha Anacaona, que desde a 3 meses la mandaron a ahorcar por justicia, y un sobrino suyo, que se llamaba el Cacique Guarocaya, se alzó en la sierra que dicen Bauruco. El comendador mayor, who was Ovando, envió a buscarle y hacerle guerra 130 españoles, que anduvieron tras él hasta que lo prendieron y fue ahorcado. Oviedo hace esta distinción entre Guarocaya, el personaje Guarocaya, y Enriquillo. I want to make it clear that's Oviedo's, what he documented. He said these were two different people. And I know that bothers some people. However, Oviedo was writing in 1546. We know that Enriquillo, his last known uprising was in 1540. Guarocaya was said to be alive and a man grown when Anacaona was unalived in 1504. Las Casas also says that Guarocuya or Guarocaya, those are variations of the same person's name, was also unalive during this time, this rebellious time. And we know that Enriquillo was never unalived by the Spanish. Oh, but don't worry. These stories don't end here. Ovando did not have an easy time of it, trying to subdue the indigenous people of the island. We'll talk about those of Higüey, who battled against Ovando and gave him plenty of nightmares. Anacaona was taken prisoner. It's assumed that this was July 1503. She was taken to Santo Domingo and imprisoned in the precursor of La Fortaleza, Osama. So if we use the scholarly estimate of July, she was imprisoned for 3 months. That would mean August, September, October. So in October of 1503, Anacaona was put on trial and found guilty. She was taken out in chains to the public square and publicly hung. Being hung was reserved for traitors. We have no idea what happened to her body, but we can assume that they discarded it just like they did all the other indigenous people. Even though Nicolás de Ovando, we have several letters from him, it doesn't seem like he ever wrote about her or even about what happened. But in my mind, I can imagine that after all the dancing, after all the food, suddenly being tied up must have confused her. But what Nicolás de Ovando did to Anacaona and her people made it all the way back to Spain, and also to the ears of Columbus when he's finally rescued by Ovando almost a year later on June 28th, 1504. He is brought back to La Española, extremely sick and blind. He then makes arrangements to return to Spain with his son and brother. They arrive in Spain November 7th, 1504. So we know that when Queen Isabella died on November 26, 1504, she was informed of what happened on the island. And Colon never returned because he ends up dying on May 20th, 1506, in Valladolid, España. And Oviedo remained on the island, causing havoc and destruction for all of the indigenous people that lived there. But her death and the subjugation of Jaragua did not bring immediate peace as Ovando had wanted it to. It actually provoked Higüey in a new uprising sprang up from La Tarde Roja. We know that after Higüey, several other villages also revolted. We know that Guava and Aniguayagua also revolted. It took them about 6 months to stop these rebellions. Nicolas's bloodthirst did bring relative peace to the island for several years, but the way he went about it was so cruel that he was called back to Spain in 1509. By that time, he had become rich. He had more than 300,000 sembraderos de yuca. He also had sembraderos de ajes, or what we today would call batata. And during that time, this was money. This made you rich. He even have recorded at least 16 places that he owned. And this is not mentioning all the indigenous people who served under him and who he essentially owned. El mismo Diego Colón wrote que tiene comendador en Santo Domingo 10 solares en que entre la mitad del pueblo y lo mejor, y no hay un lugar de toda la isla que no tenga las mejores haciendas de ella. And it seems like none of the things that he did touched his heart. For when he returned to Spain in 1509, he wrote the following to the king. He says, Yo escribo a almacén que de mi parte suplique a vuestra alteza. Lo que yo suplico es que vuestra alteza mande suplir la necesidad que me queda de pagar lo que debo en la isla española, que certifico a vuestra alteza que quedó de deuda sobre 6,000 pesos de oro. Que se pueda pagar y acabar las obras que tenía comenzadas en Santo Domingo, para que pedir licencia a vuestra alteza, pero quitándose los indios que la sostienen, será dar con todo el través. Beso las reales manos de vuestra alteza, me haga merced de mandar que no se me quiten los indios en nubarías de casa que yo tenía en encomienda. So much for Christianity.
Years later, Guati, the 16-year-old who had survived La Tarde Roja, described Anacaona in the following way. Sí la vi, she said. Ya era una señora de unos 38 o 40 años. Tenía los senos erguidos, las curvas suaves, era blanca como la savia madre, el pelo muy largo, los ojos muy negros. La admiré mucho cuando la conocí.